Every life change comes with invisible agreements. Not the ones you sign on paper, but the ones your body quietly accepts. In the first episode, we talked about psychological entry, about the moment you decide to do this work, and what actually begins inside you at the same time. Today we go one layer deeper, because no one enters high-end escort work without agreements. Some are practical, about time, about availability, about money, about privacy. But others are psychological. The problem is, most of those agreements are never made consciously. They don't happen in words. They happen in adaptation. In what your nervous system learns is required to function. This episode is about psychological contracts. Not the contracts you sign with agencies or clients, but the ones you sign internally. The inner deals about what you give, what you tolerate, what parts of yourself stay present, and what parts slowly step aside. Because once a psychological contract forms, it doesn't just guide behavior. It organizes emotion. It organizes boundaries. It organizes identity. And most women only realize it exists when they try to change. That is when the body resists. That's when the confusion appears. That's when the work starts feeling heavier than expected. As the founder of Psychologists for Escorts and the creator of the Psychology for Escorts framework, I help exceptional women understand the psychological impact of their work. Today we are going to look at what a psychological contract really is, how your nervous system creates it, and why what you don't consciously divine, your nervous system will decide. Let's begin. A psychological contract is the inner deal you make about what you give. It's an internal agreement about how an experience will affect you. Not something you write down, not something you discuss, but something your system quietly decides. A psychological contract answers very basic questions. What is this to me? What does it cost? And what am I protecting? Every time you enter a new situation that requires adaptation, your nervous system begins to answer these questions. Not in words, not in thoughts, but in patterns. In how much you open, in how much you disconnect, in how much you stay alert, in how much you soften. You don't need language to make such a contract. Your nervous system does it automatically. It does it based on expectations, based on what it predicts will happen, based on necessity, what it believes is required to function, and based on survival, what it believes is needed to stay safe. Your nervous system creates these contracts not because it's intelligent in the way your mind is, but because it's designed to keep you functioning. It doesn't ask if something is meaningful. It doesn't ask if something aligns with your values. It doesn't ask if something will still feel right in 5 years. A nervous system asks one main question. Is this manageable? If the answer is yes, it adapts. If the answer is no, it changes strategy. It may numb, it may tighten, it may become hyper-aware, it may emotionally step back. All of these are forms of contract. They are agreements about how much of you is present and how much of you is protected. For example, if your system learns that deep emotional presence makes the work heavier, the contract may become stay regulated, not emotionally open. If it learns that fully feeling pleasure makes things complicated, the contract may become keep sensation shallow. If it learns that being authentic creates vulnerability, the contract may become perform instead. These are not conscious choices. They are adaptive decisions. And once they form, they quietly guide behavior. They guide how you show up, how you connect, how you experience your body, how you experience desire. Over time, they begin to feel like personality. But they started as protection. And this is where the most important principle comes in. What you don't consciously divine, your nervous system will decide. When you don't consciously choose what something means to you, your body will assign meaning. When you don't consciously decide what you are willing to feel, your nervous system will regulate it for you. When you don't consciously define your limits, your system will create limits through numbness, tension, or exhaustion. And this isn't weakness. This is how human systems survive adaptation. And it happens in every intense environment. But in escort work, where intensity, intimacy, performance, and emotional regulation are constant, psychological contracts form quickly. And once they form, they don't disappear on their own. They need awareness to change. And that's why understanding them matters. Because these contracts don't usually appear in one clear moment. They form quietly, through adaptation, through repetition. And once psychological contracts begin to form, they rarely come as one big decision. They form as small adaptations, small internal agreements, ways the mind learns to make the work manageable. Within the Psychology for Escorts framework, certain contracts appear again and again, across different women, different cities, different experiences. Not because women are the same, but because nervous systems adapt in similar ways. Let's look at the most common ones. Many women enter with the contract, this is just work. And in one sense, that's true. It involves planning, structure, professionalism, boundaries. But the nervous system doesn't experience intimacy as just work. It experiences proximity, attention, touch, presence. And biologically, those signals are processed as connection. Not emotional meaning, not romance, but physical and relational closeness. And closeness is never neutral to the body. So When the mind says, this is just work, the nervous system must adapt. And the adaptation becomes a new internal contract. I will treat intimacy as neutral. But neutrality requires distance. To make closeness feel neutral, the system reduces emotional involvement. And this often shows up as a quiet rule inside. I don't need to feel anything. I just need to perform. Performance becomes safety. When you focus on doing things well, on reading clients, on staying in control, your body doesn't have to fully experience the intimacy. This isn't coldness, it's intelligent regulation. The nervous system protecting you from overload. But over time, this contract changes how closeness is felt. Touch feels less personal. Emotions feel muted. Connection feels more distant. And often, this doesn't stay only at the work. The system applies the same regulation elsewhere. Real intimacy can begin to feel harder. Presence can feel unfamiliar. Pleasure can become shallower. And not because something's broken, but because a contract formed. Intimacy is something I manage, not something I fully feel. Another common contract is, I'll stay myself. Strong, independent, unaffected. Often meaning as long as I recognize myself outside the work, I'll be fine. This belief feels protective. It creates a sense of control. If I'm still me when I go home, then nothing inside me is changing. But staying yourself requires definition. Who is yourself doing work? Who is yourself outside it? And for many women, that line is never clearly drawn. The work self adapts, regulates, performs, manages emotions, while the private self tries to stay neutral. But the nervous system doesn't separate identities easily. It carries learned patterns across contexts. And this is where something subtle begins to happen. If there's no clear psychological boundary, identity starts to blur. Not dramatically, but gradually. Not in a way you suddenly notice, but in small shifts. Feeling less spontaneous, more controlled, less emotionally fluid. Many times women say, I don't feel like myself anymore, but I don't know why. And again, nothing went wrong. The nervous system simply integrated the adaptation. The work self didn't stay at work. It slowly became part of the whole. And this is how identity shifts quietly. Another very common contract is, this is temporary. Temporariness is one of the most protective beliefs, and also one of the vaguest. Temporary doesn't mean harmless. Temporary doesn't mean impact-free. It only means I expect this to end. And often what that really means is I don't need to fully look at this yet. I don't need to process this yet. I'll deal with it later. Temporariness postpones awareness. It creates psychological distance. And that distance helps things feel manageable. But Here's the important part. Your nervous system doesn't work with timelines. It doesn't register months or years. It works with repetition. What happens again and again becomes the new normal. So even if something is meant to be temporary, the body adapts as if it's ongoing. Because from the nervous system's perspective, repetition equals reality. This is why experiences that were only for a while can still leave deep psychological patterns. Not because they were extreme, but because they were repeated. And this is how unconscious contracts shape emotional life. Not through big decisions, but through quiet adaptation, again and again. At some point, the work becomes familiar. And familiarity changes contracts. What once required effort now happens automatically. What once felt intense now feels manageable. What started as just work becomes routine. What was temporary becomes normal. What was clearly separated starts overlapping. Work responses appear outside of work. Emotional regulation carries into private life. Performance habits follow into intimacy. This is not a mistake. This is adaptation. The nervous system is designed to normalize what repeats. When something happens often, the body stops treating it as special. It becomes baseline. Baseline doesn't mean healthy. Baseline doesn't mean chosen. It only means familiar. And familiarity quietly reshapes inner contracts. This is where many women notice shifts. Not dramatic, not sudden, but subtle. Feeling less reactive, less emotionally available, more controlled. Sometimes it feels like strength. Sometimes it feels like calm. And sometimes it feels like nothing at all. This is often where numbness begins to appear. But here's the important distinction. Adaptation is not the same as consent. Your nervous system adapting to something doesn't mean you choose it. It doesn't mean you wanted it. It doesn't mean it aligns with who you are. It only means your system learned how to survive it. This is true in all intense environments. But in work that involves intimacy, performance, and emotional regulation, adaptation runs deep. Sometimes adaptation looks like distance, pulling back emotionally, staying in control, not fully engaging. Sometimes adaptation looks like numbness, feeling less, being less affected, needing stronger stimulation to feel something. And sometimes adaptation looks like hyper-awareness, always reading moods, always staying alert, always managing the room. All of these are survival strategies. They are not personality traits. They are contracts the nervous system created to cope. And when these adaptations stay unconscious, they begin to feel like who you are. I'm just more detached now. I'm just calmer. I'm just less emotional. when in reality your system learned a pattern, and patterns can be changed, but only once they are seen. And this is why awareness is not just understanding, it's the beginning of renegotiation. When you recognize where a contract shifted, you create space for choice again. You can begin to decide what closeness feels like, what boundaries feels like, what presence feels safe. Not from adaptation, but from intention. And this is where healing begins. But before we can talk about change, it's important to understand why awareness matters. Because when these contracts remain unconscious, they don't disappear. They quietly shape daily experience. And that shaping has a cost. The price doesn't usually show up as collapse. It doesn't arrive as crisis. It shows up as subtle shifts. Small changes you might barely notice at first. Less sensation, less emotional intensity, less curiosity, less desire to connect deeply, less spontaneity, less emotional availability. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something has been working for a long time. The nervous system found ways to manage intensity, to regulate closeness, to keep things predictable, to reduce overload. And those strategies did their job. They kept you functioning. They kept you capable. They kept the work manageable. But every strategy has a cost. When sensation is dampened, lives feel flatter. When emotions are regulated too tightly, connection can feel distant. When alertness becomes constant, rest becomes difficult. These are not failures. They are trade-offs. The body exchanged depth for stability, intensity for control, openness for protection. Over time, these exchanges begin to shape daily experience. Moments that once felt vivid now feels muted. Relationships that once felt engaging now feel harder to access emotionally. Pleasure may feel less full. Presence may feel thinner. And again, this doesn't mean something is broken. It means something adapted. Psychological contracts don't break you. They shape you. They shape how you feel, how you connect, how you respond, how you experience your body. Shape doesn't mean permanent. It means patterns. And patterns can be renegotiated. But not while they remain unconscious. This is why subtle change matters. When women notice, I don't feel as much as I used to, I don't connect as easily, I don't feel as alive. These aren't signs of weakness. They are signs of long-term adaptation. And adaptation always has a price. Not a dramatic one, but a quiet one. One that slowly reshapes the quality of experience. And once you see that, you can begin to choose differently. not by forcing feeling, not by pushing yourself, but by gently bringing awareness back to the body and allowing new contracts to form. This episode is not about changing your contracts. It's about seeing them. Not correcting, not improving, not fixing. Simply recognizing what has been happening inside. Because the moment you see an internal agreement, you are no longer unconsciously bound by it. When something remains unseen, it quietly directs behavior. When it becomes visible, it becomes a choice, not a command. This doesn't mean everything shifts immediately. A nervous system doesn't undo months or years of adaptation in a moment. And it doesn't need to. Awareness alone already changes the relationship. Before awareness, the contract runs automatically. After awareness, you notice it operating. You feel when distance appears. You recognize when control tightens. You observe when numbness shows up. And noticing creates space. Space between the pattern and your response. And in that space, possibility exists. You may keep a contract because it still serves you. And you may adjust it because it no longer fits fully. Or you may release it later when your system feels ready. But all of those options only become available through awareness. Without awareness, there's only repetition. Repetition feels like personality, but it is adaptation. And adaptation can evolve. This is why insight is so powerful. Not because it forces change, but because it returns agency. When you see a contract forming, you're no longer living entirely inside it. You are now in relationship with it. You can observe how it protects, how it limits, how it shapes experience. And that relationship is the beginning of transformation. Not effort, not willpower, just awareness. This is the foundation of psychological growth. Not pushing the nervous system, but understanding it. And allowing it to respond to safety rather than survival. So, escort work doesn't require ignorance to survive. It requires clarity. Not toughness, not numbing, not pushing through. Clarity. Clarity about what is work, what is performance, and what is self. Clarity about where you adapt and where you remain present. Clarity about what you offer and what must remain untouched. Because intensity doesn't automatically equal damage. But unconscious adaptation quietly shapes experience. And that shaping happens whether you notice it or not. Psychological contracts don't ask for permission. They form through repetition. They form through necessity. They form through survival. And contracts you don't consciously choose are still enforced, just without your consent. And this doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means your nervous system did its job. It protected, it regulated, it adapted. And now, awareness gives you back choice. Not to force change, but to live with intention. To decide what intimacy means to you. To decide how close you want to be. To decide what parts of yourself stay whole. In the next episode, we look at how these contracts continue shaping experience over time and why many women only notice the impact after they stop working. But until then, notice gently, without judgment, what your system has quietly learned to adapt to.